Halloween as we know it is built on costumes, candy, and haunted houses. But its true origin is far darker, rooted in a terrifying ancient tradition where the living feared the dead would return to claim them. What if I told you that the Halloween rituals we celebrate today were born from a festival designed to keep death at bay? The Celts believed that once a year the dead walked among the living, a night of ancient terror where the veil between life and death was razor thin, and spirits, gods, and terrifying creatures roamed free, hunting for those who dared to defy them. This isn't just folklore, this is a saga of survival, where every tradition, from carving pumpkins to dressing as monsters, was born from the desperation to survive the horrors of the otherworld. This is the story of how Samhain, the Celtic festival that became Halloween, was forged from a fear so deep that the living had to fight to stay alive. And it all begins with the first fear. As twilight fell on ancient Celtic villages, an eerie silence would settle over the land. The harvest was done, the warmth of summer slipping away, and the air grew heavy with dread. The villagers knew what was coming Samhain, a night where the boundary between life and death grew dangerously thin. One of the most chilling aspects of this night was the belief that the dead would return, not just as fleeting shadows or memories, but as physical, tangible entities. On Samhain, the dead didn't stay buried. They came back to claim what was theirs. The Celtic afterlife, known as the Otherworld, wasn't a peaceful resting place. It was a realm where spirits roamed, restless, seeking revenge, or sometimes just a chance to cause suffering. The first signs of this terror would appear long before the bonfires were lit. In the deep of night, when the moon hung high and the wind was still, the graves of the village would begin to stir. It wasn't the earth itself shifting, it was the dead beneath it. According to Celtic folklore, when the boundary between worlds was thin, spirits could crawl back through the soil, breaking free from their graves. The graves were found torn open, the bodies face down in the soil, their faces contorted with the terror of their final moments. This wasn't just superstition, it was reality for the Celts. They didn't see death as a quiet end, but as a force that could invade their world at any moment, bringing with it sickness, pestilence, and death. The very ground beneath their feet seemed to pulse with malevolent energy, and that energy only grew stronger as Samhain approached. The Celts believed that the spirits of the dead were drawn to the warmth of the living, seeking either to reconnect with their families or exact vengeance. In preparation for Samhain, villagers offered sacrifices, food, animals, and precious items not out of reverence, but out of fear. Fear that if they didn't appease the spirits, they would return, hungry for more than offerings, demanding souls. But the dead weren't the only threat. The sea, dark fairy folk, roamed freely, cursing or dragging people into the otherworld. As the night deepened, the villagers gathered, knowing something far worse could be lurking in the shadows. But something else was stirring beneath the surface. As autumn's first chill gripped the air, the Celtic people began their preparations for Samhain, a sacred night that marked the end of the harvest and the looming winter. This was more than a festival. It was a cornerstone of their spiritual existence, a time to honor the spirits through ancient rituals passed down through generations. In villages nestled near misty hills and dark forests, candlelight beckoned the souls of the departed. The Druids, revered spiritual leaders, stood at the heart of these rituals, chanting sacred incantations to invoke gods of death and harvest. As villagers gathered around the great bonfires, they offered prayers, grain, and wine to appease the spirits, hoping to ensure protection for the coming winter. The air was thick with the scent of burning herbs and damp earth, mixing the essence of both the living and the dead. To the Celts, this was a night for the return of their ancestors, spirits who would walk the earth, visit their homes, and protect their hearths. But beneath this reverence lay an unsettling truth. Samhain was not only a time for honoring the dead, but also a night when the veil between worlds thinned, allowing darker forces to cross into the realm of the living. As the rituals continued, something in the air grew heavier. The stillness of the fields surrounding the village seemed to hold a secret, a presence watching from the trees, the shadows beyond the circle of light. The Celts revered their gods, but in their darkest corners, they whispered of the Fomorians, ancient creatures born of chaos, twisted beings of the sea who came to the land on Sama night to reclaim what was theirs. They were gods of destruction, not guardians, and their power, though distant, was never fully understood. The Celts would hold their breath as they watched the flames rise, not just in awe but in fear, because even the most sacred of rituals couldn't guarantee their safety. The smoke from the bonfires would drift over the land, swirling like the souls of the dead themselves, carrying whispers from realms unknown. The safety of the living, it seemed, was never certain, and while the rituals continued to give the villagers a false sense of security, they knew deep down that no matter how much fire or chanting they invoked, the dead weren't the only ones they needed to fear on Salmon night. As the winds picked up, the darkness beyond the fire's reach seemed to press closer, as though something unseen was waiting. And with every ritual, every prayer, the unease began to mount. For even the oldest of traditions, built on reverence and protection, could never keep back the horrors lurking just beyond the light. The warmth of the bonfires flickered in the distance, but the air was thick with something far colder, an unease that the villagers could feel creeping in. It wasn't just the ritual of Samhain that began to change. Something was off. The first signs that something was wrong came not in the dark shadows or the rustling of the wind, but in the everyday, in the things that seemed just slightly out of place. It began with the marks, strange, unnatural marks found on the door frames of homes. Not scratches or carvings, but symbols burned into the wood as though something had pressed against it with unnatural heat. These marks weren't random, they were ritualistic. The patterns resembled those seen in ancient texts, symbols thought to ward off evil or to protect from spirits. But these marks didn't appear after the rituals, they appeared in places untouched by fire, away from the safety of the bonfires. And they appeared after the dead had begun their walk. The first death came quietly. It was the eldest woman in the village, a woman who had lived through countless Samhains without incident. Her passing wasn't from age or illness, it came suddenly, without warning. But it was the manner of her death that raised suspicion. Her body was found in the fields, face down, as though she had been pulled from the earth itself, her hands clutching the soil. Her mouth was open in an eternal scream, eyes wide with a terror that no one could explain. Then came the sickness. It started with one child, a little girl who had been playing near the edge of the woods. Within days, she began to waste away, feverish, pale, her skin growing clammy and cold to the touch. The sickness spread quickly, but it didn't follow any pattern. Some adults fell ill, while others remained untouched. No medicine seemed to help, and the village healer, an old woman with knowledge passed down through generations, was at a loss. There were whispers among the villagers. Was this the work of the spirits? The belief was that the dead didn't just return to visit, they returned for vengeance. But who was marked? Was it the families who hadn't properly honored their ancestors? Was it the ones who ignored the ancient rituals, perhaps out of neglect or arrogance? Or was it something more sinister, something hidden beneath the surface of their old ways? It wasn't long before suspicions turned toward the children, the ones who seemed untouched by the sickness, who seemed to act too strangely, too coldly. Some claimed to have seen them speaking in hushed tones, their eyes gleaming with an unnatural light, almost as if they were hearing voices from somewhere beyond the mortal realm. They had stopped playing with their friends and began wandering the woods, gathering herbs and stones, things that were known to be sacred to the Fae. The village began to divide. Some said it was the restless dead, the spirits who had returned to claim their vengeance. Others whispered that it was the seed, the fairies, who had taken notice of the young ones, perhaps even marked them for their own purposes. And then there were those who said it was the Fomorians, ancient creatures whose power was fueled by fear, by sacrifice. They spoke of a curse that began with the smallest cracks, the faintest signs of something wrong. But no one could say for sure. The village had been a place of comfort, of rituals and customs that kept the darkness at bay. But now, that darkness was creeping closer, closer than anyone had anticipated. That was only the first crack in the story. The mist that had once clung to the ground like a soft blanket now seemed to hover, thick and oppressive, over the village. As Salmon approached, the once comforting sounds of village life, the chatter of neighbors, the laughter of children, The low murmur of the evening fires began to fall away. They were replaced by an eerie silence, broken only by the rustle of leaves in the wind, the occasional crow's caw, and the distant howl of wolves. But the villagers knew this wasn't just the change of season. It was something darker, something far worse. At first, the signs were subtle, almost imperceptible. Livestock began to die without reason. Cows found sprawled out in their stalls, their bodies cold and stiff, their eyes wide open, filled with a strange, unblinking terror. The sheep that once roamed freely now huddled together in the corners of their pens, bleating in fear, as though they too knew something was stalking them. The smell of decay filled the air, but there was no obvious cause. The animals were untouched, their bodies not torn by predators or sickness, just lifeless. Then came the crops. The harvest had been bountiful at first, a promising year of plentiful grain and fruit. But as salmon drew closer, fields that had once been fertile began to wither. The wheat stalks turned brown overnight, and the apples on the trees rotted on the vine, their once sweet fragrance now a sickly stench that hung in the air. No matter how much the farmers prayed, no matter how hard they worked, their efforts were in vain. The land itself seemed to be rejecting them, as though something had claimed it, something they couldn't see, something ancient and malevolent. The villagers couldn't deny it any longer. Something was deeply wrong. Suspicion and fear began to creep into the hearts of the people. Neighbors turned against one another, accusing each other of causing the misfortune. Who had angered the spirits? Who had ignored the rituals or dared to speak ill of the dead? It was said that those who were marked by the spirits could bring about ruin, and it wasn't long before fingers were pointed at the most vulnerable. The children, those strange, unnerving children, were blamed first. Their behavior, their strange, faraway looks, their whispered conversations made them easy targets for the villagers' growing panic. The elderly woman who had once been their healer, the one who had known the ways of the earth and the old gods, was now avoided. She had failed. To prevent the sickness, her remedies had not worked, and whispers began to spread that perhaps she too was cursed. Rumors ran wild. It was said that the Fomorians had returned, creatures of chaos who thrived on fear, who could twist the very earth to their will. Some believed that the fairies had taken more than just the children. Perhaps they had taken the very land itself. Others spoke of the restless spirits of the dead, angry at being forgotten, their hunger for vengeance growing with every passing hour. By the time the sun dipped low into the horizon, a palpable dread had settled over the village. The once bustling streets were empty. The villagers stayed inside, locking their doors and windows tight, staring out from behind them, eyes darting nervously at every sound. The shadows that had once comforted them, shadows cast by trees, rocks, and hills, had now become something else, something alive. There were stories now of movement in the night, figures seen darting in and out of the mist, shapes too tall and twisted to belong to any man or beast. The shadows seemed to move on their own, curling and stretching in unnatural ways, as if something or someone was walking just beyond the light. The bonfires that had once stood as a symbol of protection now seemed small and insignificant in the face of such overwhelming terror. No matter how high they burned, the night still felt endless, oppressive, like a great weight pressing down on the village. The cries of the animals, once so distant, were now much closer. Sometimes, in the dead of night, there would be a sharp, unnatural screech, followed by the eerie sound of something dragging across the ground, something far too large and heavy to be the work of any natural predator. Those who dared venture outside in the early morning hours reported finding footprints near their homes, huge, elongated tracks that seemed to end at the edge of the village, leading into the darkness of the forest. No one followed them. They didn't need to. They all knew where they led. The fear was contagious. It was no longer just about spirits or fairies. It was about something living, something that had become a part of their world, something that walked among them in the dead of night. The line between the living and the dead was now blurred, and with it came a terror that no one could escape. The villagers had once believed that the fire would keep them safe, that the rituals would protect them, but they were wrong. The darkness had already crept in, and from there, everything grew darker. As the village sank deeper into fear, the once calm, orderly community became a place of desperation. The first attempts to resist came from the village elders, those who still clung to the old ways, who whispered of remedies passed down through generations. These were the last remnants of hope, rituals and practices that had once been powerful, but now felt like desperate measures in a world that had grown too dark. Garlic, once considered a humble ingredient, now became a ward against the night. It was tied to doorways, hung in windows, and tucked beneath beds, its pungent odor an attempt to fend off spirits and creatures that were no longer bound by the rules of nature. Salt, too, became precious. People would scatter it around their homes, along the thresholds, and even sprinkle it in the corners of their fields. The Celts believed that salt was purifying, a sacred substance that could seal off the entryways for dark forces. But it was never enough. Nothing ever felt like enough. The bonfires, though still burning bright, no longer had the same strength. No matter how high they reached into the night sky, the shadows still stretched too far, swallowing everything in their path. Sacred nights of ritual chanting were held in the hopes of turning the tide, but the very air seemed to thicken with dread. The earth itself felt colder, the nights longer. The people gathered around their fires in groups, huddled in fearful silence, desperately trying to summon protection, to shield themselves from the forces that seemed to watch from just beyond the firelight. At night, the air was filled with the sound of whispered incantations, ancient prayers to gods who had long been forgotten, to spirits who no longer answered. But as the days passed, it became clear the rituals were losing their power. The shadows in the woods grew longer, the whispers louder, and the strange marks on door frames only became more frequent. It was as if something or someone was pushing back against the rituals, as though the very earth itself had turned against them. The secret gatherings grew more frequent, and now fear-filled whispers spread like wildfire. The Druids, once revered as wise spiritual guides, began to meet in hidden corners of the village, in the depths of the woods where the firelight couldn't reach. It was said that they could feel the pull of the otherworld growing stronger, the tension in the air suffocating. Some claimed they had seen things, shadowy figures standing just beyond the light. Figures that seemed too tall, too wrong to belong to the mortal world. The Druids spoke in hushed tones, their once confident voices now trembling with uncertainty. Something was shifting, and no matter how many candles they lit or spells they uttered, nothing seemed to stop it. Desperate measures began to be taken. People started covering their homes with runes, protective symbols drawn with chalk and blood, desperate to keep whatever was haunting them outside. The village healer, once thought to be their greatest hope, now stood in the center of these rituals, her hands shaking as she attempted to weave together ancient protective charms. Her once reliable remedies for sickness were now ineffective. Even she could feel the weight of the darkness bearing down on them, and her once powerful words were now nothing more than whispers of fear. It wasn't just the spirits that had become unstoppable, it was the very world around them. The village was choking on the air itself, unable to breathe without the knowledge that something far more sinister had awakened. The rivers had turned dark, the trees whispered unnerving sounds in the wind. The night felt endless, the moon itself turning red, casting an eerie glow on the once peaceful fields. And still, the terror continued to grow. The villagers, once strong in their belief that the dead could be appeased, were now looking over their shoulders at the very shadows they had once trusted. The rituals, the prayers, and the sacrifices, they were all fading. The weight of the inevitable pressed down on them like a storm cloud, suffocating them from every angle. The line between the living and the dead was no longer just blurred, it was torn apart. That moment opened a door that should have stayed closed. As the fear within the village grew, so did the terror surrounding death itself. The dead were not at peace. It was an unsettling truth that hung heavy over the people of the village. Death was not the end. For some, it was only the beginning of a deeper horror. The souls of the dead, restless and unforgiving, could return, not as memories or spirits, but as something far worse. The first signs were subtle. Dreams of the dead walking among the living, faint whispers in the night. But soon, they became undeniable. Those who died violently, those whose deaths were unnatural or marked by anger, became something else, something that could not be bound by the soil. The villagers whispered of restless souls rising from their graves, not seeking peace, but vengeance. To prevent these spirits from returning, the Celts took measures that went beyond the simple burial rites. Stones were placed over graves, large, heavy stones, meant to pin the body down and prevent it from rising. Nails, sharp and cold, were driven into the coffins, a crude attempt to keep the dead from crawling out. Some even went so far as to drive stakes through the heart of the deceased to ensure that no soul would wander from the grave. These rites were rooted in an ancient, unspoken fear that death didn't mean finality. It meant transformation. The dead who had not been honored properly, who had died in anger or betrayal, would not rest. They would rise, seeking what had been taken from them. The villagers began to bury their dead in fear, not reverence. Fear that death was just another beginning. Because some of the dead refused to stay buried. The wind howled, carrying a stench of decay, as a shadow rose from the forest's edge, too tall, too twisted to be human. It was a creature born of fury, its limbs stretching unnaturally, its form a nightmare stitched together from the restless dead. The villagers, frozen in terror, could hear it before they saw it, cracking earth, a low groan, and then an eerie silence. The earth itself seemed to reject its return, yet still it emerged. It wasn't just a spirit. It wasn't just a monster. It was everything that had been buried, angry and unrelenting, a vengeful thing no stone or stake could hold back. It was the embodiment of everything they had tried to suppress. And some say, even now, it still watches from the shadows,